Everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
I'm Ann Vogel, the owner, Dragon Tail Books. But tonight we have Blair Anderson, who's a retired forest ranger, Wisconsin forest ranger, and he's going to tell us some of his stories and reflections from his time out in the field. So thank you so much for coming.
It's good to be here. Thank you for being here too. Well, this book was a fun little endeavor. You run into people and you talk and, about this, what do you do? Well, I do this. What do you do? Well, I used to be a forest ranger. Okay, forest ranger, and they ask in different ways, but it's sort of like they're asking, did anything cool ever happen to you? And I go, oh yes, sit down. I used to tell stories and people were, there's just stuff that happens with people and so forth. And so it was fun and they were entertaining to people. And sometimes they'd say, oh, you should write that down. That's good. And COVID kind of got me. I wrote another thing during COVID because there was nothing else to do. Yeah. And so I kind of got into a little bit of rhythm of writing and I started thinking about this and I had notes and lists of stories and I'd think of something and write it down. And so I ended up then just kind of putting this together. It's mostly stories, but there are, it says stories and reflections. I got some reflections on some different things that are I observe, some related to my job, some related to where I lived and so forth. And just coming to understand some things that I didn't before. I grew up in Chicago and I worked for a Fortune 500 company for 4 years in the 70s. Of course, child of the 60s, we're all idealists and we have to make our mark on the world. And so I decided business on its own was not good enough. I had to mix that in with resources somehow. And so after a little bit of research, it appeared that forestry probably had the best opportunity to put those two together. So my wife and I left Chicago and came to Madison, and I went to school at UW-Madison, studied forestry with the idea of going to work for a big forest products company. Yeah. And making my fortune and doing business and saving the world all at the same time. And I finished it in Madison in 1980. And I don't know how many of you remember back that far, but the job market was in the tank. That was right at the end of the Carter administration, beginning of the Reagan administration. Interest rates were high. And it was just a mess. Back in those days, you had a resume. It was a piece of paper. And you sent it to people. You didn't email it to people. And you didn't post it on your Facebook page or
LinkedIn or something.
Yeah. There was
And it could only be so many pages and the cover letter really made a difference.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. And I sent out a lot of those letters and I got the sum total of my responses were 2 no thank yous. And I got nothing else. So Friday, I'm late in school and talking to some of the guys that I was doing the forestry courses with, and well, a bunch of them were going to take a test the next day. And I was like, what is that? Well, it's a test for the forestry jobs in the DNR. It was an open thing. I had anything else to do. So I thought, well, I may as well take the test. And I did. And they called sometime later and offered me an interview. And again, I thought, what could it hurt? So I went to interview, and a little bit after that, then they offered me a job. And I thought, well, Yeah, yeah, nothing to lose here. It's something to do until a real job comes along. And 31 years later, I retired. So,
It didn't
It's-
hurt.
yeah, I say life is what happens when you're making other plans. So that's kind of how it was with me, but I got into this whole, I'd never worked for a government agency before or anything. It was not profit oriented. So it was a different world. And we went to, I started in summer of '80, and the program then was we were hired like in a class. There were 16 of us. And we went to Tomahawk for 3 months for some training. Most of the training had to do with the forest fire side of the program, because most of the forestry stuff we kind of covered in school. And there were some principles related to fire, but this was kind of nuts and bolts, because some of us, not all of us, were going to end up at stations that had fire control responsibilities. Some were going to be in places that were strictly forestry, but they wanted flexibility. So we all went together and did 3 months of training in Tomahawk. So you get to know some people. Then we went to training stations, and I got to a new one because we had some medical needs. We had to stay close to Madison. Anyway, after a few months of that, then I got offered the job at Spring Green, which was a job that had fire control involvement. And so decided to take it, and we ended up moving to Spring Green, Wisconsin, in spring of 1981. And that was kind of the beginning of the whole thing. It was just, a little bit of a town. I got exposed to rural life, got exposed to the concept of a volunteer fire department. I'd never heard of such a thing. Being from Chicago, everything was professional. It just kind of opened up a whole new world of community, and people doing things together. And I remember trying to put my finger on what was so different. And it wasn't so much that I saw the same people all the time, but after a while, you never saw new people. I mean, everybody, you go into town, and everybody you saw, you knew.
You're gonna see him the next day too.
Yeah, that's right.
Makes you
Yeah,
behave a little different.
yeah, doesn't it though? Yeah. And you see him here at the grocery store, and an hour and a half later, you see him at the hardware store. And that night, they're at the school board meeting, and Sunday, you'll see him at church. So it was different. And then this volunteer fire department, and seeing other stuff that happened, roles people played, volunteer, just kind of for the good of the community. It was all this mutualness. And it was really pretty cool, and like nothing I'd ever experienced before. So it was great fun. And then the work-wise, the fire thing, I suppose I should prove all of the boys. Fire is fascinating.
Seemed exciting.
Yeah, but it was really fun, and I enjoyed that. And there was kind of a little bit of a mano a mano thing about fire, which was stimulating to me. Worked with all kinds of different people. I had we had 58 ranger stations in the state. Spring Green was one of them. It was a very large area of responsibility, because they didn't come into the program until the 50s. And the northern 2/3 of the state, the part that's in it, and there's a map in the book, they came in the late teens and 20s. And so they're in some more challenging fuel types. So they're smaller areas. Mine was huge, include parts of 4 counties, and I worked with 22 different fire departments. So just keeping track of things and connecting. For 4 counties, so I worked with 4 different sheriff's departments, 4 different district attorneys. Well, one of those counties was Dane, which of course is a whole another game unto itself. But you know, figuring out different people and how they're motivated, how they work and so forth.
What was your responsibility? Any fire on public land? Forest
Oh.
land, grassland, whatever?
It wasn't just public lands. The DNR by statute in our areas of responsibility, which included my area, is responsible for all non-structural fires outside of incorporated limits.
Anything out in the country?
Anything out in the country, yeah. Public, private, yeah. And we worked with the fire departments. We had agreements with them. And obviously in my huge area, you know, at least 3/4 of the time, they were there before I was. But they essentially were acting as an agent of the department. And we, in some cases, we paid them. They had a choice of how they could do things. Sometimes we reimbursed them, but then we also had billing authority if somebody was responsible for the fire. And so sometimes they'd say, we're not going to bill you because we in turn would bill the landowner if they had done something they shouldn't have done. And landowners would say, wait a minute, how come I'm getting a bill for $150 from my local fire department that I pay taxes to every year, you know? And so some departments said, well, we're not going to bill you. And so that was fine, whatever they wanted to do.
And can I just ask about?
Sure.
Was your wife also from Chicago? Were small towns new to her too?
I was in the first town north in Evanston, and she grew up in, for heaven's sakes, again, Homewood, which was south. So we were both right next to Chicago, but it took over an hour to get from my house to her house on the Tri-State Tollway. Yeah, so she was not, this was new to her
So
too.
that both
Yeah.
of you-
Yeah, it was new to all of us.
And you didn't get, you weren't part of the back of the land movement from going to school in Madison?
Well, no,
Down here, be the one to live in the country?
no,
Well,
no, we weren't there. We were,
that's
but
what's here,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. There were a lot of things that hatched out of this. I was born in '53, so I was in my mid-teens toward the end of the '60s, and I was probably, you know, if I'd been 3 years older,
Yeah.
I probably would have taken tighter hold of some of the revolutionary fervor that comprised the '60s. But I was still kind of a innocent observer at my age. And
So
so,
don't let me sidetrack you.
Oh,
I just
no,
wanted to
no.
know if you.
no, we got, you know, ask questions if you have. That's, you know, I don't have a ton of structured stuff to share with you. But anyway, we kind of grew into things in Spring Green, and my wife Jan was a teacher of the deaf, and so she got involved there, and all sorts of different things. We had some reproductive problems, which is why we needed to stay close to Madison, and so that was part of the whole thing. But I enjoyed the work very much, and I very much enjoyed the law enforcement part of it, which was sort of a surprise to me because I'd never had anything to do with that. We had,
Would have you fire bans, that kind of stuff?
well, yeah, we were credentialed, so we had authority over parts of the statute book. Yeah, there were fire bans, but we had to understand constitutional law, if you will, search and seizure, rules of evidence, all that kind of stuff, because we had situations that most of my stuff was fire, but I got into timber theft
Oh,
sometimes, yeah,
yeah,
and which is kind of
it happens.
it does happen, and it's very lucrative. timber's valuable, especially when you don't have to pay for it. And it's kind of a different beast. I quickly cultivated relationships with all my sheriff's departments, and when they had somebody was missing trees, of course, they'd call the sheriff, that's who you call. And they would in turn hang up the phone and call me. Because it's understanding a theft of a car in a house or something like that is one thing, but where trees are missing, it's like,
Where'd they go?
where'd they go? And I don't even know how to begin to look at this. So they come to me, and to me, it was a great, it was sort of had elements of a puzzle,
Well, yeah.
trying to put it together.
Where would do this? Where would they
Yes.
take it? What would they?
Yeah,
Where
yeah,
would it go? Yeah.
yep. And you could figure things out pretty well. There are a few stories in here about timber thefts.
And not just Christmas tree.
Oh, no.
The veneer
All the
logs.
lumber,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot of walnut down there. There's some up here, but there's a lot of it. It's closer to its core range down in the southern part of the state. Well, I had a buddy that I went to school with who started his own consulting firm. And he sold for a property owner. He sold on the stump, the perfect tree. It was a very large walnut, clear 3.5 logs up with branches. He sold that tree on the stump for over $15,000. So the one tree.
And when was that?
Oh, that was back in the 80s.
We
We
didn't
have any
have,
walnut trees?
not many.
This was the perfect walnut tree. I mean, this was, what the forester lays in bed at night designs in his head.
We had a lot of poplars where we.
Oh, yeah.
But we also had, our gardens were out here, and then there was this spot here, and there were a row of little saplings, and they were all walnuts. that
Yes,
The people that lived there before us had planted them, thinking they'd get them transplanted. But
Yes.
of course didn't, so they were too close together, and,
Yeah.
they keep a lot of vegetables from growing.
oh, yeah, yeah.
That they didn't last, we
Yeah.
got rid of them.
yeah. But if you plant a tree, you already know that it's not gonna be mature in your lifetime.
Yeah,
It's just a different way of looking at things.
right,
I had-
they must have thought they'd sprinkle them around the farm.
I had one interesting theft, which was not so fascinating as a theft as who was involved. I have to remember the guy's name now. But it was a set up sale, legitimately set up, and guy had worked out with the property owner, how they were gonna cut, where it was gonna go out, and all that sort of thing. Let's see if I can find this here. Oh, here we go. So these guys are cutting on this fellow's property. Oh, I just remember. Cutting on this guy's property, and they're skidding them out to this place out here, and they scale them there, and then based on that scale, they pay the landowner. Well, they're up cutting in these on the hill on the back of the 40, and there's a fence there, and boy, there's some dandy looking trees just across the other side of the fence. I don't think there were walnuts. I think there were oaks, but they were veneer. They were nice trees. So they decided that they were deserving of having a few of those. They were on the back end of a farm, and farmers are busy farming, and the only time they get into their woods, and not always even then, and not all their woods, is for deer hunting. That's the only time they take off. So some of these places nobody ever gets to. So they cut these trees, and they didn't want to pay this guy for them because they weren't his trees. There's a certain perverse logic in that, but so they decided they're going to take them out another way and just kind of hot log them, just pick them up, drag them down there, and get them out of there right away. Well, there was a little strip of land there. They had to drag the logs out across that little strip of land to reach the highway. This was in southwestern Richland County, which was out of my area, but the ranger in Richland Center was new and didn't know how to do this stuff. So I got involved. So anyway, I went over there. It was a house, a little house on the other end of the sliver. And I went there a couple of times, couldn't find anybody. So one of my buddies on the Richland County Sheriff's Office, I contacted him and said, hey, I can't find anybody out there. Could you see if you can find somebody there? And if you do, here's some questions I want you to ask. Trying to figure out what was going on. So a week or so later, he calls me and he says, oh, you're going to love this. I said, oh, great, talk to me. And so he said, well, yeah, there is somebody there. And they did see stuff happen. They were brought out there, and within an hour and a half, log truck came by, picked them up, loaded them up, and they were gone. And I said, okay, great. So what is it that I love here? And he said, well, we got a name of what was on the truck. And I said, well, I was pretty sure I knew who that was already. He said, but do you know who lives in the house there? And I said, well, I remember looking on the plant book and it was owned by this guy. Yeah, but he rents the house out to somebody. You know who lives there? And I'm kind of like, we're playing 64 questions here. I said, no, I don't. He said, it's Carl Armstrong. Does that name ring a bell?
No.
Carl Armstrong was the mastermind with Leo Burt and David Fine and his brother Dwight Armstrong of the Sterling Hall bombing at the University
Oh,
of
really?
Madison, Wisconsin. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Yeah, that happened in the middle of the night, was designed to not hurt anybody, but there was a researcher in there. Fosbach, something like that. It was a family.
That's wild.
Yeah, isn't that something? He was arrested a couple of years later in Toronto, and I think he served 10 years. And he was living out there. He was living quietly. I think he had a food cart that he operated on the square in Madison. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, he just kind of kept to himself. So he was going to come in then.
So this was the witness?
This is the witness. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So later, we're going to trial on this. And I think we were in the second day of the trial, and it was the day he was going to testify. So he came in, and we were going to meet with him. And I got word from the DA that they had worked out a deal with the perpetrators, the defendants. And so everything was done, and I met him, but I didn't have a chance to sit down and, prep him like I'd hoped to. But yeah, that was, and I had pretty much the same reaction you did when he said, it's Carl Armstrong, and I was then going, Carl Armstrong. And the name kind of rang a bell, because it was, it was closer temporarily when it happened back then. This was almost 30 years ago.
But he didn't get arrested for that.
Oh, no. Oh,
yeah.
he did eventually.
Oh, was it after his prison term that he lived in a little house?
It was after the prison term.
Oh,
It was in his
okay.
house. Yeah. He had escaped, and I think that 3 of them were arrested at different times in Canada. And Leo Burt, to this day,
They
Never found him?
no.
This guy escaped too. Carl did for a while.
Well, yeah, they all got away for a while. 2 of them were arrested in Toronto, not at the same time, but that's where they caught up with Carl, and he was extradited and tried and sentenced to 10 years, which is, for killing somebody as a.
Could have been worse.
Yeah, it could have been worse, and I think the fact that it happened at 4 o'clock in the morning and was designed. The whole thing was designed to not hurt any person.
It makes a big difference whether you tried to kill somebody or you.
Yeah, I think that's what he was convicted of.
So did you work for the DNR your entire career?
Yes.
In that area?
I was a Spring Green Ranger for 21 years, and then I took a field supervisor job where I had, I guess, just 2 rangers and 4 foresters working for me. kind of in that same area. My office is just down in Dodgeville, 20 miles south of Spring Green. And then they broke out there was a position in Madison that oversaw the fire control program, and all the insect and disease stuff, and something else, and it was too much. So they broke out the fire program to just chief of forest fire management. And I was interested in that, and I interviewed, and I got that job. So that's what I did. I oversaw the whole fire program for the last, I don't know, 9.5 years.
The whole state.
Yes.
Wow, that's,
Yeah, it was fun. It was a little boy's job.
so
You know, the whole
was,
fire thing.
was the biggest, they had a big fire up, by the Eau Claire Lakes area in northwestern Wisconsin.
Yes.
Pretty nasty for a while.
Yes.
Is that about what was the biggest fire during your tenure?
Well, there was a long dry stretch right before I was hired. They hired a bunch of classes of forest, like there were 16 in my group. I think they hired 2 classes in 81, another in 82, another in 83, and 2 more in 84. They really beefed up the whole program. From 76 until 1980, there was just a terrific drought, and there were a lot of big fires in Wisconsin. I think the biggest one I think was 77. It was called Brockway, and it burned. It was in the Black River Falls area.
Or like the work around the state forest?
Yeah, it burned. It burned out across the freeway, and
Oh, it was black down there for quite a while.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
that's right.
yes,
That's
yes.
right.
That fire was, I think it was about 17,000 acres. And so they just changed a lot of things. They got more equipment. There's a story in here about a guy, the only guy that was, if you will, killed in the line of duty by fire. We lost some fire department people that helped us on a few occasions. Oftentimes they were people that were maybe older than they should have been, and they just had a heart attack. And
Volunteer guy?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. This guy got caught on a fire and tried to make a run for it, got burned over and killed. And it was right just the other side of Eau Claire. It's called the Canoe Landing Fire. I think it's north of Fall River. Don Eisbrenner was the guy's name. And I was I'd only been working there for 2 years, and it was kind of a Yahoo cowboy thing with me. And then we found out that guy had actually been killed, and it was quite sobering.
Yeah.
The largest fire we had when I was there, I think, was probably the 3rd year I was a chief ranger. This would have been the worst fire, I would say. We had what we called the Cottonville fire, which was in Adams County. Adams County, yeah, it's that sand country.
Yeah.
Sand country, you got a lot of pine, and pine is the most volatile fuel type that we have in Wisconsin. So this was south of Rapids. Fire burned, I want to say something like 3,400 acres. We lost 100 structures, and I think a lot of those were, garages or outbuildings, but I think 20 of them were homes. Yeah, full-fledged homes. We had
That was kind of an all hands on deck kind of.
Oh yeah, very much. It was off of 13. I think it's Highway C that goes east out of there through Big Flats. And it burned north. I argued that we had 2 fires we had 2 big fires that day. There was one up, they called it something acres fire because it burned through a settlement up by Peshtigo. This one started at a property that was off a road there called Chicago Road. The first road it crossed was Cottonville Road, so they called it the Cottonville Fire. I argued that we should have called this one the Chicago fire and this one the Peshtigo fire. And we could have
Yeah.
copied 1871.
So this is mostly on private land,
Uh,
or is there
I
county
think
forest in
exclusively
there?
on private land.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, and we had a guy that he was almost in trouble. He got too far ahead of the tractor. He's putting in a plow line with a John Deere 450. And he got too far ahead of the guy behind him, and they had a slop over, and so he was trapped. Somehow they got a hold of him and he got out of there. But we were close to trouble with that. That was in 2005, and we had control lines around that whole thing. That burned from where it started to where it ended was 7 miles. So we probably had 18 miles of control line around that thing. We had that in by midnight.
What's
Wow.
that mean?
We had the way you stop a fire, you know, you gotta have the three things. You gotta have fuel, you gotta have heat, and you've gotta have a source. So you gotta have oxygen. So you eliminate one of those things. And what we do with our 450s that have plows on the back, they go along and they just peel the ground open. So there's no fuel there. So we eliminate that one thing from the triangle and it stops the fire and you
That's what
open.
we call a control.
Yeah, yeah. And a control line might be a hose line where you wet it, you take the heat away and stop it that way. The plow line is better, water line to dry, but that doesn't change. So we had 18 miles of line plowed in around that thing.
So can a road be a control line? Is it-
What's that?
Can a road be a control line?
Oh,
by
absolutely,
itself?
absolutely, yeah. And oftentimes when you're strategizing how to deal with a fire, you look at things like that. You look at roads, you look at hay fields where you don't have fuel, or a lake or something, and you go, let's try and run it into the lake and hope it doesn't blow across. Yeah. Do you want to hear something?
I was just
Sure.
gonna say, pick a favorite story, cause I feel like our questions are keeping me going.
No, it's-
So you have two books?
I'm gonna tell you about this book. This is, I'm gonna talk a little bit about community. This is not my book, but
Oh, okay.
this is a fun book. This is an important book. So I'll tell you about it. I don't know how we are for time.
25 minutes.
So I don't know if people have places to be tonight.
Supper at home.
Yeah, there you go. All right, here's a story. This is a funny one. This is true too. Yeah, some aspersions on me, but I couldn't help it. This is a story called What's the Bug? I have to put on my glasses so they fit well over my hearing aids. It was still pretty early in the fire day when the phone rang. Don't you think it's a little windy for them to be burning at the dump today? I didn't know who was calling or which dump they were referring to. In theory, the municipalities were supposed to clear with me any burning they did before they started. Who is this? Just someone who lives in town and is concerned about all the smoke. Where are you? Right here in Spring Green. So apparently there was burning going on at the dump west of Spring Green. I was a little surprised because Spring Green was usually pretty good about getting in touch with me before they did any burning. The west wind was supposed to continue at a fairly brisk rate throughout the day, so I decided I should go in and check it out. As I passed the fire station, only half a mile or so east of the dump, I noticed that the doors were up and a couple of the trucks were out.
Uh-oh.
But when I reached the dump, the gate was closed. The wind was strong enough that all I could see was smoke. So I parked on the side of the road and clambered over the locked gate to see what was going on. The wind let up a little, so I thought I could sneak around to the east side of the fire, under the smoke to see what was on the far side. But as soon as I committed to that, The wind picked up and I found myself progressing to the north through very heavy white smoke from the fire. There was nothing to do but continue, so I persevered, feeling my way through the smoke, knowing that I would soon be in the clear. Though it seemed to take an eternity, I finally cleared the smoke, albeit coughing and with irritated eyes. As the view became clear, I was surprised to see not only Spring Green's fire trucks, but also several police squad cars, all with associated personnel. One of the squads was Spring Green Police, and the rest were from the Sauk County Sheriff's Department. They were safely to the north and west of the pile, well out of the smoke's range. The presence of all these vehicles perplexed me, and I had some difficulty trying to make sense of what was going on. As soon as I emerged from the smoke, heads began to turn in my direction. I recognized quite a few of them, including some of the cops. Smiles quickly showed, and some of them began to laugh. After a quick look around confirmed that the fire was confined to the pile, I found myself confused about what was apparently so funny. One of my friends, a Sauk County Sheriff's deputy, walked up to me with a big grin. "Are you okay?" Still befuddled, I responded, "Yes, I think so. I just took some smoke." His grin broadened. "Yeah, I see that. What's going on?" Another friend from the Spring Green Fire Department had joined us by then. My cop friend said, "I'll let him explain it to you," and walked away chuckling. Through periodic guffaws, I was told that the county had initiated a coordinated effort in the southern part of the county to identify and eradicate wild and not so wild patches of marijuana and gather and burn them. That's what the fire was. That's what the smoke was that I had walked through. And that apparently is at least part of why I couldn't figure out what was going on. As I began to wrap my head around what I was experiencing, I started to catch up on everyone else's laughter. It got to be kind of funny to me too. Soon, it also occurred to me that I had an official emergency vehicle parked out by the gate, and I suddenly was in no condition to operate. Eventually, after they'd all had their fun with me, one of the firefighters drove me back to the ranger station in my truck. And soon after that, somebody from work drove me home, at which point I promptly took a long, pleasant nap. As I recall, I still got paid for the whole day. My work was a very high priority. Oh,
They don't warn people about that.
well, there were some subsequent discussions, none of which were taken terribly seriously. Yeah,
So you don't want the neighbors to know because they might all come.
Yeah. Yeah, I asked the guy to stop at Culver's on the way to my house, but he said, no, I had to get back. I was hungry. Oh. Yeah, there's a section in here too on community. And there's some stories related to that, but part of it is just kind of observations about how that works. And then there's a section in that too on the farm, and that kind of gets more toward this, but just observations about the role that the farming, the family farm plays in rural community like that was always one of those things I didn't pick up on as clearly right away, but the longer I was there, the more I saw and understood it. We have a great wrestling tradition at Spring Green. We have a lot of state champions, and almost to a person with farm kids. You know, you learn a lot of things on the farm. Let's read you a quick paragraph out of here. Fine, this isn't nearly as fun, but it's good. Glasses. This is just a couple of paragraphs. On the way home from somewhere, I had stopped at a farm to speak with the owner about a tree planting he'd inquired about. It was close to 8 o'clock at night. I pulled into the yard as a tractor pulling a full hay wagon came around a knob from a back field. I waited as he pulled up and stopped, stepping out of the door of the cab on the other side. Around the front of the tractor came a skinny little fellow who couldn't have been more than 10 years old.
Yeah.
He purposefully walked right up to me and very politely, but very authoritatively asked me, "Can I help you?" In that one question and the way he asked it, so much about what a farm imparts became clear. This was his farm too. His politeness in responding to my presence betrayed his appreciation of the blessing it was and the need to treat others well because of it. But it also communicated a sense of hard-fought ownership rooted in his sacrificial response to its demands. He understood the justice of the farm, what it required and what it provided. That simultaneously led to a servitude to the land's demands, a dependence, but also an appreciation of what the land could and would provide in exchange for faithful service. Some people never learn that principle of justice. This kid was 10 and already got it.
That's good.
That's a great paragraph.
That just kind of summarized, how that works.
Did you ever do much writing before you wrote this book? For pleasure or for fun? Or-
Before COVID.
Well, I wrote, I did a lot, I wrote a lot of investigative reports for work, which are a very different kind of thing, but,
Yeah.
but
Non-technical writing.
it's not technical, but enormously detailed
Right.
and written, thinking in terms of what the law requires.
Right.
And then I'll answer the rest of your question. For example, we can go on private land when there's an exigency. So there's a fire. I can go onto your land. I don't need permission to go on. I can go on there and we can do what we need to do to put out the fire. And I am within my authority to be on your land as long as we're there. If I decide, okay, this fire's under control, it's night, winds are calming, it's cooling, humidities are going up, it's not going anywhere, but it needs to be checked in the morning. Well, now my right to come onto your land in the morning, that's a little dicier, because do we have an exigency? Well, I could say, well, yeah, we do, because I don't know that it's out. But what I learned to do was do everything I needed to do to find out what I wanted to find out while I was there in the first place. And my boss used to kind of get on me because, there'd be a fairly small fire and I'd be out there for 3 hours. It's like, what are you doing out there? And I said, well, here's what I'm doing. And he used to tease me about my reports because they were endlessly detailed. And I always started them off the same way. I talked about displaying my badge because one of the criteria was that the person you're dealing with needed to know that you were a law enforcement officer. And so I always said that at the front end, that I displayed my badge so there was nothing to come up they could say, well, I didn't know who he was. That kind of thing. So I did that kind of writing. I retired in 2011. And I kind of got into this thing. Did I talk before about family pictures? Didn't I? Or didn't I?
No.
Maybe you weren't
I
here.
think before you.
Oh,
Okay, yeah. Well, I don't know. All the pictures and family seem to come to our house. And everything. And I don't know why that was. It's a small family, but I could deal with most of the stuff with these pictures. At some point I realized that I was the last one around that knew who some of these people were. And so I thought, well, I should label those so that, the next generation knows. Well, then some of them, I thought, oh, I know some more about these people. I have some experiences with these people. My grandfather and my 2 grandmothers and my Uncle John. And so I thought, I need to put some of those together. So I started writing stories and turned into a whole COVID project finally.
Oh.
And that was, I think I had local printer bind up 15 copies of that. Mostly just for family. I mean, it was never published or anything, but you know, it was every bit as long as this with all the stories in it. So it was quite a production. And then I think that kind of just opened the door to the idea that maybe I could put something like this together. And I did it sort of as a gardener. I think of a story and I write the story and I kind of park it. So what this is, I laugh with people. I say it's a good bathroom book because there are lots of little stories in it, and you can read for 10 minutes, read a story, or even
Yeah, I
5
think
minutes.
that's a good procrastinator. But that's what I do. I go, well, I'll just read this one little thing before I go.
Yeah. It's perfect for that.
Yeah.
You'll get months of good sleep out of it.
So did you ever have any experiences where you went on someone's land and they were not happy about you being there?
Oh yeah. I had a number of those. There's a story in here called Liar, which is the first time that I accused somebody of lying, which maybe doesn't sound like so much, but when somebody is, you know, telling you this is what happened, and you know that that's not what happened, it's, at least for me, it was not something I'd ever done before, where I just stopped and said, well, no, wait a minute, that's not true. You know, especially somebody you don't know. And so that's kind of what that story is about. It's sort of a fun story. Yeah, but I had, I would investigate smokes. Burning wasn't allowed until during fire season, which is spring here, and different from out west. Fire season is basically from the time the snow melts until the time things green up. All the vegetation is dead, and as spring goes on, it becomes cured and ready to burn. So during that time, burning is not allowed during the day, only after 6, and then you have to have a burning permit. So if I'm tooling around and I see a smoke someplace, any daytime burning, as a ranger, would have to authorize. I know I didn't authorize anything over there, so what is that? Is that a fire? I don't know what it is, but I'm gonna go check it out because I don't know. And sometimes I'd roll up at that and I'd get a bunch of lip. There's another story in here. It was a really fun one. You want to hear another one? All right.
Sure.
All right, I'll read you. No, this one story I'm thinking of. This guy was burning, and it was not a dangerous situation, but he lived right off a highway, and he was burning during the day, and that's
In
bad.
fire season.
Yes, that's bad PR, even if it's not a dangerous fire. Most people don't know a dangerous fire from a safe one. So I pulled in there and he came over and he was not happy with me. So his fire's over there and he's standing there, he's standing here, and I'm talking to him here. As I'm talking to him, a little gust of wind comes along and picks a leaf up out of his little pile, sets it in the little ditch line next to it, and it starts burning. And I'm watching this, and I'm enormously entertained by this because it's not going to be a problem. I mean,
Here's why we have this rule.
yeah, and I could go out, with 2 cups of water, and put the thing out, so it wasn't a problem. But he said, well, no, that could never happen. I said, well, sometimes those things do happen. In fact, it's happened right here. And he turned around and he doesn't know it, so he starts freaking out. And I just go on kind of casually talking. Sometimes these sorts of things happen and they can get away. And when that happens, it could start walking in different directions. And, we need to be careful about this. And I'm just kind of going on like this. And the guy's finally like, are you going to do something? And I said, yeah, I'll do something. Said, but I just want to make the point with you first. It was kind of fun. I enjoyed it more than I should. This is a fun one too here. This is called Out of the Mouths of Babes. And a little child will lead them. That's from Isaiah 11. Some fire situations include an eclectic mix of human elements. This one occurred less than halfway through a spring season month. It brought together a violation of the ninth commandment and a measure of redemption delivered by a child's precociousness. The woods were beginning to dry out, but weren't at any real risk of becoming the long-running, heavy mop-up fires that could come later in spring. At the north end of the county, 30 miles away, I heard a page for a grass fire east of my home station. Knowing there were no oceans of grass in the area to breed a large fire, I dismissed responding immediately as I was occupied finishing the mop-up of another fire. Sure enough, within a half an hour, the fire department that ran on it was headed back to their station. It was late in the day before I returned south, so I resolved to investigate the fire the following day. The next morning, I went to their fire station, let myself in, and got their run sheet, which had a variety of pertinent information on it. Some departments completed these more thoroughly than others. When they are well done, run sheets usually have some cause information that is helpful to me when I visit the fire site and speak with the people involved. Atypically, this particular report was a little sparse, but it had been Sunday. Maybe they were in a hurry to get back to their homes. One piece of information the report did include intrigued me. The property owner was an officer on the fire department. I drove to his rural property a couple of miles out from town. An acre or so grass field had burned, as well as a brush pile in one corner near the town road and the driveway that led to the house in the rear of the property. Based on the winds from the previous day, it was a pretty safe guess that the fire had started in the brush pile. I spent a couple of minutes at the end of the driveway looking at burn patterns and confirming my suspicion of the pile as the source of the fire. Hank, the fire department officer, not his real name. Hank, the fire department officer who lived there, had apparently seen me, and as I drove the 100 yards to the house, he came out to greet me. Hey, Blair, I never thought you'd be coming here to check out a fire. He greeted me laughing. We knew each other and got along well enough. I chuckled back. Can imagine. I turned toward the brush pile where we both knew it started and asked, what's the story? Well, I don't really know. As he started to respond, I sensed something was a little askew. I couldn't put my finger on it, but he seemed more uncomfortable than upset. I wasn't home, but there have been some bikers around. I've never seen them until recently, but I ran into them last week at the end of the driveway. We didn't have words, but it wasn't all that friendly either. All I can think of is that it was them that set the pile on fire. I'm not sure. Huh, why would they do that? I don't know, unless, like I said, we didn't hit it off too well the other day, and they were trying to send a message or something like that. I don't know. The I don't knows felt like disclaimers for everything else he said. So I decided to press him. Wow, you think they started that pile in your front yard in this dry weather with those winds in your house right here? You must be furious. Well, yeah, he stumbled, his anger awkwardly delayed. I hate to think what could have happened, he blustered a little too late. Have you contacted the police? I asked provocatively. Not yet. I'm going to figure out who those guys are first. Something was wrong, but I still couldn't be clear on what it was. At that moment, the cutest little pixie of a girl, maybe 6, burst out of the house and came skipping toward us. She stopped when she reached us and reflexively grabbed her father's hand. Hi, she said to me, overflowing with curious joy. Who are you? She asked most engagingly. Crouching to get on her level, I said, hi, I'm the forest ranger. I'm here to learn about the fire you had yesterday. That must have been pretty exciting, huh? Her eyes grew wide. Oh, yes, she exclaimed, aglow with excitement. Daddy lit the brush on fire and got away. He giggled. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is not grin. I glanced up at Hank, then back to the girl, and made the most non-evaluative response I could think of at the moment. It's a good thing they got it out before it got to the house. Poor Hank. In the flash of a moment, he had a crucial choice. Does he correct his virtuously honest daughter on what she said, which we all knew was the truth, and face the awkward, morally corrosive consequences with her? Or I too had a choice. It really boils me when people lie, and it's even worse when it is a fire person, a colleague of sorts. The little voice of vengeance in me wanted to call him out on his lies right then and there. But the call to self-control prevailed, I'm humbled to say. Hank and I locked eyes, still holding his daughter's hand, but looking at me, he confirmed, Daddy made a mistake. Good for you, Hank, I thought. Lying was wrong and he knew better, but he chose wisely when the stakes were ratcheted up, when it mattered. Looking back at the girl, I said, we all make mistakes. It's nice to meet you. She responded politely. I'll talk to you soon, Hank. I stuck out my hand. It was as good an ending as I could have hoped for, considering how it began. Later, the chief called me with a half-hearted proposal that the fire department would not send us a bill for this fire, so their guy wouldn't be on the hook for it from me. Nope, can't pick and choose because of circumstances. He knew better. Billing is my call based on circumstances. Hank got the full treatment. That was a cute little girl.
Did you and Hank ever talk about it again?
No, I don't think we did. I think I sent him a bill and he paid it, and we just kind
Let
of,
it go.
we just closed the door on that because we had to get along.
Well, I'd like to say, I think you did the right thing too, because otherwise you would have been telling that little girl that
Yes.
her dad lied.
Yeah,
That's not good either.
no, no,
Yeah.
no, no.
What's the brown book there?
What's that?
He wants to know
Oh.
what you're gonna tell us.
Yeah. Just a young man, Brian Reisner, he reviewed my book and some of his comments are on the cover. He's a young guy. He was a friend of my younger son's. And Brian did some of his growing up in our kitchen.
Mhm.
So I've known him for a long time and we're still in pretty regular touch. He grew up in southeastern Sauk County on a dairy farm. The book is called Land Rich, Cash Poor, My Family's Hope and the Untold History of the Disappearing American Farmer. So he grew up on a dairy farm, working dairy farm. He had chores all the time. Well, he's got a sister, and she's running the farm now. He was not going into farming. He got into journalism, and he worked for a couple of newspapers in Wisconsin, and then he got into a communications role with Lamar Alexander's office, a Tennessee senator. And so he worked some in Nashville and some in Washington, but he's got good political chops. So it's a book about their farm and his experience. He talks about his grandparents that came over and started the farm and all the struggles with, with dairy, with milk prices and so forth. But on the other side of it, he has a very good understanding of the policy initiatives in the whole ag sector and how they are helpful and not helpful to family farms. And the thing I like about it best is about the last 25 or 30 pages are the policy. He's got them listed. Here's what we can do to fix this. It seems particularly pertinent with all that's going on here in our new administration.
Is he a farmers union guy?
What's that?
Is he a farmers union guy?
Well, he's not a farmer.
Well, I mean, it's family.
I don't think so. I think he's got a bunch of ideas. He's got a list. I'm trying to find the first one here. Start a research and development revolution. Remake government policy around competition. It's got all kinds of very pragmatic ideas. And one of the things, and he cites a lot of examples of this in Wisconsin, is identifying
Sorry.
dairy related niches, cheese specialties, that kind of thing.
Value
When I-
added.
Yeah,
Ice cream, yogurt, yeah.
when I started, I'll bet you there were 15 cheese factories in my area. And a lot of them were, mom and pop
Yeah.
type things. A lot of those were fire wardens. There's a story in here of, the old outdoor editor with the Wisconsin State Journal, Steve Hopkins. Yeah, does that name ring a bell, anybody? He was there for ages. Well, he called me up one time and he wanted to ride with me. And so we did. He came and there was quite an article in the paper about it. There's a picture of that in here. But the story of that whole thing. But we stopped at one of my fire wardens who was a cheesemaker, and they had just finished and had just cut stuff. So they had fresh curds that were still warm. They had warm curds. Boy, that's just, and so we got a bag of those, and I made a comment about how they squeak when they're warm, and I like that. And that ended up in his article. But anyway, by the time I left, or at least by the time I retired, I'd say in 2011, I think there were maybe 4, maybe 5 cheese factories left. And all the rest of them, it was just too much.
It used to be all around here.
Oh, yeah.
And when they were milking in cans,
Yes,
and it was how far could you drive a wagon with 8 cans of milk or whatever?
yeah,
That's where the cheese factory.
yep,
So they would serve this.
Yeah.
They would serve all the farms in
yes,
a little bitty area, a
yeah,
few miles each way.
yes, yeah.
Do you know about the town? Because I sort of vaguely remember things. That's my skill. That's the end of it. But I don't ever remember the details. So tell them about that big book you have about the Wisconsin idea, or what is it called?
Well, I've got this, I have a big book at home from, published about the lands of Wisconsin. It's a DNR. It's a big copy.
No, but that book where you learned so much about how the dairy cooperative first formed and all of that stuff, and how it started out that the dairy farming was so poor, and they learned all. And
Well,
the
there's a
beginning
book,
of
there's a really
extension.
great book.
That's
If you haven't read this, it's about the best book I've ever read about the history of dairy farming in the state.
Okay,
And it's called The Making of Dairyland. It's written by a guy who's a historian, I think, in Madison. And he takes you all the way through, because as you may know, it used to be wheat farming was the big,
Yes, yes.
was the big thing in Wisconsin.
yeah,
And the reason, and then this whole transition that was really guided by the university
yes,
of because they used to have farmer schools in the winter in
oh,
Madison.
yeah,
that farmers would go
ag
to,
short course, yeah,
right? And the
yeah.
whole thing about just creating this industry of
Yes.
cheese and food processing and all of that.
Yes,
So it's a really
so
remarkable
Interesting.
story.
yeah,
I think
Yeah.
I should look it up. I think it's called The Making.
Creating Dairyland, Edward Janus.
That's the book.
okay. Interesting,
Edward Janus, Janus.
okay,
Says how caring for cows saved our soil, created our landscape, brought prosperity to our state, and still shapes the way of life in Wisconsin.
That's like, it goes through the whole thing when they invented the silo. Now, because before they invented the silo, you couldn't milk cows all winter. You had to feed.
yeah,
So when they invented the silo in
Yes.
Madison, then all of a sudden,
Yes,
you had this agriculture that you could do on a pretty small scale. It was okay, it was kind of hilly, it was okay, it was cold. But you got paid every,
yes,
like a regular job.
yes, through the winter when you didn't have crops.
That was the miracle
Yeah.
of it. And so all these boom bust wheat farming and everything, it was
Yes.
just in doing the wrong thing in the wrong place.
Yep,
And then it created this
yeah,
quite period of prosperity.
yeah,
And another thing I think you must have noticed coming from Chicago, the rural area was for me was I don't know, it was just like I guess it was sort of not awakening exactly, but it just felt like, well, this is a really important thing for people to understand. Because I grew up in Illinois, Belvedere,
oh, sure,
and before that, Onarga, which was between Kankakee and Champaign.
Yes.
Illinois. Okay, so so I was familiar with little towns and then a county seat and
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, and eventually, I mean, now it's so influenced by Chicago, but it wasn't at first.
yes,
Okay, and so, and then I went to school in St. Paul, and then we were some of those hippies that moved out to the country. And did that, we went first to Kentucky, Missouri, and then came back. Wisconsin, and so I knew little towns quite well, and my parents were teachers and active in the communities, and we knew a lot of farmers and stuff. But you know, in Kentucky, we when we went to Kentucky, it was tobacco farms, and one of the things I learned is that similarly to dairy farms, they can exist small. They can be small and still be
Labor
profitable.
intensive.
yes,
Yeah, and
yeah.
the same thing, the hilly land. You
yes,
weren't gonna, you know, in Illinois, you had this rich
Yes.
farmland right there.
Big
That all
takes
changed
land,
so much
yeah,
too, that the soil isn't even black anymore. It was so black.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
but what the little towns in Kentucky still had lots of stores and little restaurants and everything, and we had already lost them in Illinois and then in Wisconsin, and then continued to lose more. And you know, and to realize that how that was tied to losing the small farms.
yes,
So because
yeah,
you know, and then once those people had to work in a town, they had to go from, we were living up by Boyceville, they had to come into Menominee to
Yes,
work at
yes.
or Eau Claire even, and
Yeah.
so that's where they shop. And
Yeah.
Mama started from there. And one of the high school teachers in Boyceville that lived there first and in Menominee for a long time, still does, told me that there were 21 businesses in Boyceville when he first,
Town of 1,000.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and there were about, I don't know, 10 at most, 6, you know,
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
half of them were bars
yeah,
by the time we were there. And even us, we lived 2.5 miles out of town, 2.5 miles south of Boyceville, 4.5 miles north of Nap. And there were, so, you know, the farms that we were lost even in that,
yes,
how many years were we there? From
15
83,
something.
no, more than that, from 80 to 30, from 83 to 15. we lived there.
Right.
Yeah, and just so
Just
lost
watch
so
it
many
happen
farms
before your
just in that
eyes.
2.5 miles, and then
Yeah.
so many houses built that aren't
Yes,
farms anymore, you
yes,
know, and so it
yes.
changes. But then some things very slowly start to, you know, now there are businesses in the related to that little town. It's not the bread and butter businesses, you know, it's
Yeah.
not the basics, but little niche things that
Yes,
people
yes,
start.
yes,
So,
yes.
so it is another rural lifestyle kind of
Yeah.
development.
I remember some of the smaller communities that had fire departments. Increasingly during the day, which is when we had most of our fires, they couldn't put together enough people to respond because,
They were at a job, working someplace.
yeah,
Yeah.
Rock Springs, everybody was unbearable working. And
Well,
so you'd have to call on another fire department to help.
And they were the EMTs too.
Yes,
And yeah,
yes, yes,
yeah,
yes.
and Bob used to work for a rural ambulance district, right? That wasn't
Well, kind of.
called. But anyway, and that was in Missouri, and
Okay,
also one of those things when you said you had never heard of a rural or
Cause the ambulance,
volunteer fire
ambulance districts
department.
were all
Yeah.
volunteer too.
Yeah.
yeah, I was an EMT for 6 or 8 years. Then I got elected to school board, so I was never home. So
So
I
you
had-
made a
I
lot
had-
of friends then.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I always said I don't know how people could be coaches or school board members because everybody has an opinion about the job they're doing.
Yeah,
And, yeah, it's constant complaints.
I was on the board, I was on the school board for 4 years. And then I got.
For
elected-
Spring Green,
Yeah, River Valley was the school district. But I got elected president. And my first act as president was to go into closed session to do, interviews for a new school superintendent. And we ended up hiring a middle school principal as a new superintendent. That was Jamie Benson, who was John's son. John Benson was the Wisconsin school superintendent
oh,
back in the Dreyfus. So I don't know whose administration he was elected, school superintendent.
probably Tommy Thompson, he was governor for 50
Yeah, that
years,
might
you
be,
know.
that might be. Yeah, he was governor
He was
for, it might have been
there.
Thompson. Anyway, Jamie and I started together. I mean, I was president, he was superintendent together. Did that together for 8 years before I finally stepped down. But he was a good guy to work with. We had some tough stuff, you know, in consolidation, we closed some rural schools.
Yeah, those elementary schools.
Yeah. And take, you know, you just sort of cut the heart out of it. But you cannot, I mean, economically, you just could not justify it. People were
Just
just
35
breaking
kids
under
in the
the
school or
tax.
whatever, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks much.
Thank you, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What's
Do
that?
you know where Prairie Farm is? Little town market.
I don't think so. I've
Anyway,
only been here for 2.5
that's a
years.